right, there I am. Cool. All right, everybody, happy Friday afternoon. The sun's shining, the snow is over, and hopefully it's smooth sailing into summer from here. Oh, Greg's on video too. Cool. All right, so for those of you who don't know, my name is Emily. I am owner and founder of Ally HR Partners, which is a human resource consulting firm that helps mainly small businesses, but small, medium-sized businesses with their HR needs. So perhaps you don't have an HR person, or you're one person wearing multiple hats, including the HR hat, and you need additional expertise and help with anything from compliance to more strategic HR efforts with things like hiring and performance management. That's what we do, is help small businesses with those things. And then also joining me today is obviously the folks from Paylocity, Matt and Greg. So thanks guys for sponsoring this event and helping us put it on and offering the free DoorDash gift cards to people. So hopefully everybody got that and is enjoying some food today. And then also on this presentation is Jeremy Higgins from Higgins Agency Group. I don't know, Jeremy, if you want to do a brief intro for yourself.
Yeah, great. I've been in the consulting space for about 20 years now, with a background in both payroll, HR, and employee benefits. So really, what we'll attest to here is anything. We'll focus on cobra subsidies, but anything along that. My company specializes in everything employee benefits, insurance related, Affordable Care Act changes, American Recoveries Act, COVID-19. A lot of fun things. The benefits just aren't your health, dental, and vision anymore. So that's where our area of expertise really lends a hand for companies here in the Western New York and regional area.
Great, thanks. And I will attest to the fact I worked with Jeremy now for quite a while, and he's my #1 go-to benefits person for my clients who have, providers that aren't servicing them, or maybe they're just looking to shop around. He's awesome. He provides an awesome level of expertise and just make sure all of his clients know what they need to be doing, and is very proactive about it compared to a lot of providers and brokers out there. So if you're looking to make a switch, I would strongly consider Jeremy. All right. So today we're going to talk about, COVID. What else is new? But the most recent round of updates with different legislation that's come out federally, also at the state level, but even, CDC and DOL and IRS guidance that has come out on some of these things as well, and how they interplay in there. So that includes the leave requirements and options that are now out there and what those are, because God knows that continues to be confusing day by day. Aid, we'll briefly touch on the aid that's out there and the different things that have come out and changed with some of the funding that's available. And then Jeremy, of course, is going to talk about the cobra subsidy requirement that was in the last relief bill as well for COVID. So as I mentioned, what's new, basically as a result of the American Rescue Plan that came out at the federal level, New York State's issued a few different things in the last month. Leave wise and guidance wise, the CDC continues to adapt its guidance on COVID. The IRS continues to issue guidance, and the same with the DOL. We continue to track these things and try to get these to you guys as quickly as we can, so you can stay updated. And that's what we're going to talk about today. So the first topic, employee leave. I hate that we're still talking about this, but we are. It's a constant moving target. So the first leave we're going to talk about is New York State specific. So we've done some additional programming and webinars on this, so I'm not going to go deep into like the fundamentals of what this is, because hopefully you know by now. But all employers, basically, unless you fall into a really narrow caveat, are required to offer paid COVID leave to employees if they need to isolate or quarantine due to COVID exposure, or having COVID themselves, or having symptoms. So if you're under 99 employees, generally that means 5 days of paid leave, and then an additional up to 9 days for a total of 14. And those additional 9 would be unpaid, but still job protected. And then 14 paid days if you're over that 99 threshold. Just some quick updates on, when someone needs to quarantine or isolate now, because we know that keeps changing with more people being vaccinated, or more, guidance or evidence on the efficacy of the vaccines. But Quick reminders here, and this is all on my website too for future reference, but for exposure to a known COVID positive person. So if someone has COVID and an employee is exposed to them, employees must quarantine for 10 days, regardless if they have symptoms or not. So exposure right now, I think, is 15 minutes or greater of time with someone unmasked. So if you have an employee who's exposed and has that experience to someone who's positive, they do need to be out of work for 10 days, regardless if they show symptoms or not, and regardless of if they test positive or not. You will need to provide leave for that time. Employees exposed who have tested for COVID-19 within the past 3 months and recovered do not have to quarantine. So they have enough immunity still, that's not considered exposure, and they don't need to get tested again as long as they don't have symptoms. So if someone's exposed, but they've had COVID in the last 3 months, they don't need to quarantine or isolate as long as they're not symptomatic. Employees who have been in close contact with someone who has COVID are not required to quarantine if they have been fully vaccinated against the disease. So that's both rounds if they went for one of those shots. And I think it has to be 15 days out from the vaccination, I believe. And if they show no symptoms, then they do not need to isolate or quarantine. And then obviously for positive test results, employees must quarantine a minimum of 10 days, regardless of symptoms. If you test positive, you should not be going to work. Continue to check the CDC website and the New York State website for updated guidance on this. I will mention, even right now, New York State's guidance on this, which is what's listed here, is slightly different than the CDC's, and New York State's will always win out while we're in New York State. So make sure that you're checking both of those sources. So that's the latest on New York State paid sick leave for COVID. A big update in the last month was the New York State COVID vaccine leave. So in addition to that leave, you must provide employees for isolation or quarantine reasons. You also must now provide leave to employees to be vaccinated. So all employees in New York State are eligible for up to 4 hours of paid leave to get vaccinated. So that's just the employee. It's not to help someone else get vaccinated. And it also does not cover if they have symptoms from, negative symptoms from being vaccinated. So it's kind of like voting leave. It's just to go get the vaccination. It covers both doses. So I think right now the Johnson & Johnson single dose is still suspended. So most people are getting 2 doses. And it also covers future booster shots. So right now we don't know, but it sounds like, COVID vaccines might require booster shots within a year. And this law covers employees until actually the end of 2022. So it sounds like this will be around and this leave will be out there for a while. A little bit after releasing this requirement, New York State did issue some guidance that gave employers some rights here, so employees can't abuse this. So you can require proof of vaccination in order for the leave to be paid. So if someone says they're going to get it and they have to get it during work time for some reason, you can require proof that they got the vaccination before you process that paid leave time. But make sure that you're weary of their rights to confidentiality. So only the people who are processing payroll or like the HR person should get that information. And it should be minimal. So it shouldn't have too many personal identifying details. You don't necessarily need to ask them what kind of vaccine it was or things like that. The law does not apply retroactively. So only employees receiving vaccinations on or after March 12th when this law passed are eligible for this leave. If someone got it before, too bad, so sad. It's not like a freebie where now you get 4 hours of pay. Paid leave may only be used for the employee's own vaccination, as I mentioned before. So it's not for taking your grandma, your sister, your mom, anyone else to get the vaccination. And it doesn't require time missed because of adverse effects. So if someone is sick right now, if you're only doing the New York State required leave, if they get sick after being vaccinated, they would just need to use regular kind of sick time or PTO time for that. And then employers may require some notice for when an employee plans to take this leave. To me, this seems totally reasonable. If someone works for you 3 days a week, certainly they could schedule their appointment on a day they don't work for you. So you should be pretty good to push back on that. And they should be able to arrange for something not on work time. So I'm happy to answer questions on this in the end, but just another leave on top of all the other leave that's been implemented this year for New York State. Um, okay. Yeah, I see a question here. I thought FFCRA could be used for side effects, and now we're going to get into that. So good point. So everything we just covered is basically, if we lived in a world where only New York State law applied or was relevant, that would be the case. Of course we don't, and this has been one of the toughest parts about navigating all the leave stuff during COVID is, what is New York State doing? And then what is the federal government doing? What's required, what's optional, what wins out, all of that. So this is a huge update. And actually in the last 2 days, it's becoming more relevant because President Biden was announcing his encouraging of employees to provide paid leave for getting vaccinated and the federal government offering the tax credit for that. So let's talk about the state of all of that. So as we all know, in 2020, the federal COVID leave was required for all employers under 500 employees, basically. So that was 80 hours of emergency paid sick leave if someone had to quarantine or isolate themselves. So basically that overlapped with the New York State leave requirement. And then the 12 weeks of the emergency paid family leave, which is like a souped up FMLA for childcare reasons if schools were closed and things like that. Well, after April 1st, all of that became voluntary. So you did not need to provide that leave federally, but you still could choose to do so as an employer. And in many cases, that made sense because you still had to provide it for many of those reasons on a state level. And instead of paying out of pocket, if you elected to do it this way, you could still take that FFCRA tax credit. Well, this has changed again. So that voluntary extension went till March 31st. And now it's been extended again, April 1st through the end of September of this year. So employers can still voluntarily provide the FFCRA equivalent or CARES Act equivalent leave. It's not required. But there are a lot of caveats that you should know about this. And this is probably where a lot of people have questions or don't really understand what the pros and cons of doing this might be. So of course, obviously, all the same rules apply here, or the same eligibility. So emergency paid sick leave, employees can take that for their own isolation or quarantine reasons. But you should know that the eligibility reasons for taking that after April 1st have been expanded, and that does include, yes, for getting vaccinated and also for, dealing with the side effects or negative side effects of a vaccination. So if you get sick afterwards, you could now take emergency paid sick leave if your employer is offering that to you up to 80 hours or 10 days of pay at full pay. It also now covers seeking and awaiting test results. And those are the major ones. So again, do you want to voluntarily offer this? You might want to, you may not. Things to consider, we'll talk about, but certainly you can see there's overlap for these reasons still with the New York State leave that you still have to provide. Also, something you should know, if you decide to do this after April 1st, you now have to reset every single employee's eligibility balance back to that 80 hours or 10 days. So previously this was a one-time shot. Once you use the emergency paid sick leave federally, whether it was for actually being sick or having to just, quarantine because of exposure, you only got to use it once. So if you got sick or exposed again, this wasn't available to you. Of course, the New York State, you can use up to 3 times, but at least federally, the employer could only take the tax credit leave and tax subsidized leave once per employee. So knowing that, perhaps you don't want to voluntarily opt into this because now all of your employees can take 10 more days off paid. Of course, you're being paid back by the federal government for this. But again, if you don't want to lose that headcount, and God knows recruiting is difficult right now, and headcount is hard to keep up anyway, you may not want to do this. Also, as part of this extension, it does apply to emergency paid family leave as well. So that is the 12 weeks. So FMLA equivalent 12 weeks at 2/3 of pay. And now all of the emergency paid sick leave reasons also apply to emergency paid family leave. So if someone needs to take leave for being sick or isolating, greater than 80 hours or 10 days, they can now take additional time under emergency paid family leave up to 12 weeks at 2/3 pay, not full pay, but still with additional time. And that's a big change from the previous FFCRA reasons. Previous family leave does count. So if they took it before, it does eat into their 12 weeks now still. And know that the first 2 weeks are no longer unpaid like they used to be. So that full 12 weeks would be paid at 2/3 pay. Or if the first 2 are the emergency paid sick leave, the first 2 are 100% pay. So a lot to consider here, a lot to digest here, but these are major changes that you should know about. So if you are an employer and you, as employees take leave for COVID, if you're automatically, or your payroll company is automatically applying that as FFCRA leave, you want to look into that, because if you don't want to voluntarily be doing this and you want to opt out so you don't have to reset everyone's clock to 80 hours and offer them leave for being sick from the vaccination, which is probably really ripe for abuse. If your payroll company is applying that credit, it looks like you're opting in, and therefore you'd have to opt into all the terms, which could be a problem for you later if you decide to push back on someone. So things to consider, weigh the loss of staff through abuse and expanded eligibility versus the benefit of the tax credit for mandated reasons anyway. So as we know, New York State requires this leave for quarantining and getting vaccinated, at least 8 hours for vaccinations. So if you have to provide that anyway, maybe why not take the tax credit, right? So, something to consider there. We also don't know if people are going to be catching COVID a second or third time, or what's going to happen with vaccine shots. And New York State might continue to make these things more required here. So in that case, maybe you want to just opt in, because then at least you're getting the federal tax subsidy for the time and getting your stuff back. Remember that the FFCRA also covers healthcare expenses for the period. So if an employee is taking the 10 days or 80 hours of leave while they're out and you're paying them for that, you also need to pay their healthcare premium for that time. And that also is reimbursable through the tax credit. So make sure that you're doing that and that your payroll company is coding that properly. Again, you must do this for all employees. So if you opt into anything, you have to opt into all of it, which means all of your employees get 80 more hours. You can't just pick a segment of your employee population to do this for. Documentation is always key. Make sure you're documenting and substantiating employees' eligibility for this leave, either through requesting a Department of Health notice saying they have to quarantine, or having them fill out a self-affirmation form, which we do have copies of on our website. So make sure you're doing that, but also documentation and payroll as well, tracking it there so people don't overuse the time. And then make sure you have payroll codes for the different leaves. So if you're not going to code everything under FFCRA and you're just going to do New York State, make sure you're differentiating between New York State paid COVID leave and New York State vaccine leave. And also things like New York State paid sick leave, which is just the law that went into effect this year for regular sick time outside of COVID, and other PTO. You want to make sure you're tracking all this separately so that someone can't use over the amount they are eligible for, and that you don't over apply the tax credit if you do decide to go that route. And in case you ever get audited, if someone claims that you didn't give them the time that they were entitled to. The record keeping is going to end up being really important here. And I think down the road, we're going to see a lot of issues with those people that didn't do proper record keeping. So that's pretty much the conclusion of this section of the presentation on leave. I did want to point out, if you're using Paylocity, or if you're not using Paylocity, I mean, hopefully you are, but if you're not, they do really offer a superior product in terms of tracking time and the different, payroll codes that can exist in the system to track the time. So you can easily keep track of that per employee on what they've used and report it out very easily. So if you have a system that's not working for you in that way now, you might want to consider changing systems, because again, I think down the road, whether it's employee complaints that they didn't get what they should have gotten, or just random audits that the DOL starts doing, you definitely want to make sure you have proper record keeping of all of this, especially if you're doing the tax credit, because the IRS then has a reason to come in and audit whether you legitimately took that tax credit or not. And having reporting and good data now will make a big difference later for that. So any questions on the leave at all or anything that we just covered? We will be, I see one question, will we be able to get a copy of the slide deck? You will get a copy of the slide deck and also the recording of the presentation afterward. We will cover this. For the FFCRA, someone said up to 2 days FFCRA for side effects from vaccine. I mean, actually, in theory, if someone wanted to just say they were sick for 10 days after getting the vaccination, I don't see anything that says they couldn't take the full 10 days of the FFCRA leave for being sick after the vaccination. So to me, that's one area where there's a ton of opportunity for abuse here and something you want to consider if like a lot of your employees haven't been vaccinated yet. I don't think a lot of employees know about this, but you know, they seem to be getting more educated on a lot of this stuff and taking advantage. So, all right, we will move on then. So I'm going to really briefly cover some of the funding and aid that's out there for COVID. I'm not an expert on this, and I kind of was trying to be an expert on PPP for a while, but then gave it up and left it to the CPAs and the banks at some point because it was becoming so complicated. But if you haven't, you know, taken funding as a business as it relates to kind of COVID impacting you, I would really recommend doing so. There's so much out there now, and they've really lowered the standards in terms of forgiveness or, you know, interest or barriers to getting the money. And I'm sure your business has been affected by COVID. So you might as well get your hands on some of this, and they keep putting more funding into it. So PPP, there have been a lot of changes here since, you know, last year or when it originally came out. Reminders that your payroll spending component for PPP must be 60%. So it was 75 and now it's down to 60. You do need to apply for forgiveness within 10 months of your covered period, which covered period has changed a few times. Make sure you understand that. Remember that in general, your forgiveness reduction is generally tied to the restoration of your headcount and salaries. So unless you took a loan that's pretty small, you should try to make sure that your headcount is back up to normal and that you've resumed any salary cuts in order to make sure you're maximizing your forgiveness amount. And then remember that loans under 150K have reduced forgiveness requirements. There are shorter form documents in order to apply for forgiveness for those smaller loans. So there's some quick reminders on that. What's new in the most recent relief plan, new funding was added to the PPP. The application for a second round of PPP is May 31st. So make sure if you're interested, you get that in. I do think there's been some new provisions added to what you can spend that on. And I think some of it includes tech upgrades, which could include converting to a new payroll or HRIS system. So if you're considering that and Paylocity looks appealing to you based on this presentation, maybe you want to consider doing that now and then using some of your PPP funds to pay for that. Could be a good opportunity for your business right now. There is expanded nonprofit eligibility. So if you're a nonprofit tuning in, you may be eligible now when you weren't before. Second job, PPP loan borrowers must demonstrate that they have had a 25% reduction in gross revenues year over year. So there is that additional qualifying caveat here. So if you're considering it, you know, that would be something that you would obviously need to prove. And then a big thing is PPP funding, and getting PPP does no longer eliminate your eligibility for the employer retention. So that was something that was in place before and that kept a lot of people from going after that ERC funding. So we'll briefly cover what that is. But again, if you're interested in looking into this more, I would recommend reaching out after or talking to your CPA or your bank. But basically, The employee retention credit is additional funding if you maintained your headcount during COVID, which even includes now into this year. So it's a reduction in, you get that funding basically through a reduction in your taxes. Eligible employer for 2020 was basically someone who fully or partially suspended their operations due to a government order, which is probably everybody. And your gross receipts for such quarter had to be less than 50% of your gross receipts from the same quarter in 2019. So for 2021, that's actually changed a bit. So you can still get this money for 2021 or this tax credit. Again, you have to be affected by COVID, but your gross receipts now have to be less than 80% of that for 2019. So these are for pretty severely impacted businesses. And then this could be 50% of the first $10,000 in qualified wages per employee for 2020. And that in 2021, it's 70% of the first 10,000 of qualified wages paid per employee in each quarter. So, it's a lot of money. It's a big tax credit out there. Again, just an additional way to kind of get some, try to get yourself at least back to even from any financial damage that you suffered last year. The big takeaway here is just if you got PPP and you previously thought you couldn't qualify for other things like this ERC credit, you may want to look into this now. Also startups, if there's any, newer businesses in here, with the new change, startups are now eligible for this. And then there are other, more beneficial funding available for severely financially distressed employers. So if you had 90% or more of your revenue taken away or gross receipts taken away, you can have all wages that you've paid to employees considered as qualified wages. So that's huge. Probably gyms and things would be most qualified for that. And then just remember, you can use PPP and the employer retention credit together, but the same wages cannot be used both to qualify for forgiveness of PPP and ERC. So that's a caveat there. You can't use both numbers or the same numbers to calculate your eligibility for each. Again, something to discuss with your CPA or your bank if you're applying, and just to be aware of. Quick notes, restaurant revitalization fund. This was a huge win for restaurants in the employee emergency relief bill. So if you, yet need additional funding to help make yourself even, at least from COVID, this might be something that you want to consider. It can be used to cover payroll costs, mortgage payments, rent, utilities, maintenance, and operational expenses, which is huge. So, if you're a restaurant and, you should really be able to almost totally recover, at least break even during this COVID time based, compared to 2019, based on this new restaurant revitalization fund. So if you are a restaurant and you haven't looked into this, I would highly recommend it. And then I do want to remind everybody, FFCRA leave payments cannot be double dipped with ERC or PPP. So if you're paying employees for COVID leave under the federal COVID leave, you need to make sure that you are coding that properly in payroll for this reason too, because you can't use those numbers to qualify for then that money to also be forgiven or counted as a tax credit in the emergency or in the employee retention credit, because you already are getting a tax credit for that leave that you're paying out through the CARES Act and the FFCRA. So again, another reason why all this stuff is a reason why you need to make sure in your payroll system, it's really able to track and code all of this leave and funding and different stuff that's going on with COVID, because you might be in big trouble later with the IRS if you do not do that. All right, Jeremy, take it away. COVID, any questions, or Cobra, I guess, any questions first on the funding? Not that I'm a total expert in that area. All right, and just everybody will get a copy of this, so not just those that are asking for a copy afterward.
Okay, thank you so much, Emily.
Take it away.
All right, we will shift gears over to the COBRA federal subsidy. The COBRA federal subsidy has really turned COBRA upside down as far as how it is being processed and handled for at least the next 6 months when we look at what's going to happen with this. So Fortunately, I know a lot of employers, a lot of my clients weren't too happy with the news here, with the fact that you guys would have to start and pay the full 100% of the premium for the next 6 months for a former employee, and then turn around and submit for a credit for those premiums through the form of a Medicare insurance tax credit on your 941s. So there's a lot more work, a lot more risk involved in the actual process going forward. So I'm sure everyone's been aware of it, the communications that have gone out. Whether you're using Paylocity's COBRA administration services, whether you're using a third-party administrator, whether you're doing it yourself, or whether you're using direct bill COBRA service through the insurance carriers directly, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Independent Health, Univera, everyone is doing it slightly different. So I'll try and untangle all this for you. I'll touch base on the general overview of how the COBRA subsidy works itself, the new notices that are now available, several different notices depending on the communications, and then I can dive into deeper on what's going to happen here, at least locally, with the different insurance carriers. Some good, some actually disappointing from what they've decided on. So again, as it relates to the actual COBRA subsidy itself, all right, starting April 1st, and as of right now until September 30th, the COBRA subsidy will apply where for someone who loses coverage, and they lose coverage involuntarily, all right, anyone that resigns, anyone that quits, anyone that doesn't show up, anyone that was terminated for gross misconduct, you are not going to be eligible for the subsidy. It's for someone that you as the employer let go. This will trigger the new COBRA notices. The COBRA notices now come in two formats that need to be sent out. The new 11-page COBRA subsidy documentation that gets into the COBRA rights, typical to our COBRA notices that we've had before, but then also diving into the new COBRA subsidy, what's available to them. The employee is kind of making their own determination if they are eligible or not. There is a separate form that needs to be completed by the potential enrollee themselves, who is attesting to they meet the requirements for the subsidy, and they'll need to sign that off. And it's almost like an on your honor system, because there's no way really for a COBRA administrator, and there's no way for you as the employer to really track and validate if they are offered other health insurance coverage. The IRS has given this a name. They've called them assistant eligible individuals, AEIs, when we go back and look at. So there'll be a process for us to actually evaluate recent terminations. When I say recent terminations, that's technically a termination of anybody in the past COBRA period who could still be eligible for COBRA today. There'll be a slightly different notice for COBRA notifications going out for all new terminations that are taking place April 1st and after. There'll be a third notice that we're going to have to send out no later than September 15th that will be advising all of the AEIs that their COBRA subsidy will be ending. So when we take a closer look at the actual eligibility of the COBRA itself, qualifying events. Let's just talk about the specific examples of that, okay? Again, anyone that quits, anyone that resigns, anyone that's hired for gross misconduct, COBRA subsidy does not apply. Anyone that has a dependent that is aging off due to age, also not a qualifying event for the COBRA subsidy. What's a big gray area right now that we're still looking for some clearance on, clarification is for those that reduce hours. So if I go from full-time to part-time, that is COBRA subsidy eligible. However, there's conflicting information as to if this is a voluntary reduction of hours or an involuntary reduction of hours. Clear answer is if you, the employer, take someone from full-time and make them part-time, that will trigger COBRA, that will trigger the COBRA subsidy. But if an employee takes themselves from full-time to part-time, will that trigger the COBRA subsidy? We have conflicting information from attorneys and legalities. We're looking for more from the Department of Labor on that to see what exactly the correct answer is in that. So stay tuned for that once we get clarification from that aspect of it. Once that's elected, all right, the COBRA subsidy, how that's going to work is you as the employer are responsible for the actual premium. So Now, depending on how you're handling COBRA, whether you're doing it direct, you're using a service, right? This is where it's going to be different and change, okay? Take Blue Cross Blue Shield, for example. I'm not sure if most of you may have Blue Cross Blue Shield, some of you may do. You may have noticed Blue Cross Blue Shield has already made the arbitrary decision to take all of its direct bill COBRA members and terminate direct bill COBRA and suspend it for this time and put it back onto the employer group invoice, regardless if the employee, the AIE, is eligible for the subsidy or not. Blue Cross Blue Shield is basically throwing their hands up in the air and saying, we don't want to deal with it. So they're suspending direct bill COBRA services for the next 6 months, and they're going to be on your group bill. So now you, as the employer, need to notify your former employee that they need to now send a monthly check to you for the next 6 months for their COBRA premium. That's creating all sorts of headaches, as you can imagine. Univera and Independent Health are taking a slightly different approach. They will put direct bill COBRA participants and remain on direct bill COBRA if you are able to let them know by a certain date, all right, if the person is eligible for the subsidy or not. If they're not eligible for the subsidy, they'll stay on direct bill COBRA. If they are eligible for the subsidy, then those two carriers will transition those back to your group bill. So there's a lot of coming and going. There's a lot of evaluation that needs to be done now as you're looking at your records, as we need to have these things completed by the middle of May, at least for the look back period for all of the folks that have parted ways with you prior to 4/1 that are still in their COBRA eligible status. Emily, if we go to the next screen. Okay. So real high level, to oversimplify this process, what are the milestones? What are the things that we have to do to make sure that we prepare for this? All right. Number one, look back at all the employees that have termed, verify the termination reason for anyone prior to Form 1 to try and determine if they're eligible for the subsidy or not. And if we're unclear if they're eligible for the subsidy, we need to send them a letter. We need to send them a notice. Okay. The new notices are all posted onto the Department of Labor's website. You can also get that from your broker or your COBRA administration service. If you're outsourcing it to a third party, they should have these notices. They should be assisting you in this process and the determination and sending those notices out. Please know that some of your COBRA providers may charge additional fees or cost or services for these additional new letters that are going out. Going forward, there's a new notice that needs to be sent out. Make sure you're using the latest and greatest. So for any terminations that you have 4/1 and after, that gives the rights to the former terminated employee if they're going to be COBRA subsidy eligible or not, and they need to make that attestation and complete both forms and sign that and send that back out. So you have that for backup, as you'll need that so you guys can make sure that you get your write-off as the employer back as a reduction of your Medicare tax. As we move along in that process and we get closer to the subsidy end, which is scheduled right now for September 30th, which may or may not be extended. We'll see when we get there. But another notice will have to be sent out to all participating members enrolled in COBRA that subsidies will end. That notice needs to be sent out by September 15th to let them know that starting October 1st, their COBRA will go back to them being responsible for that. So at that point in time, that's when the carriers will need to be touched again, whether it's Blue Cross Blue Shield, Independent Health, Univera, to flip them off of your group employer bill back onto direct bill COBRA, or if you have a third-party administrator, to make sure that the bills are starting to go out for them and that these participants are making payments to be reimburse you for your monthly invoice. So similar to what Emily had mentioned before, just make sure that, again, the health insurance premiums covered, since these are going to be employer paid premiums, again, are not double dipping off of the FFCRA leave tax credit eligibility between the mix. But certainly you should have been reached out to by your COBRA administrator or your broker to help you navigate these changes. Should anyone need any assistance or have any questions or need help with that, feel free to reach out to me and my team, and I can help shed some light on that. Any questions on the new COBRA process?
No questions. All right. So just a reminder to everybody on some resources that are out there if you're not aware of them, if you're looking for information on like a lot of the funding that's out there, EIDL, PPP, there's different, guidance on things, especially funding related. The SBA website has great stuff. My website, we're constantly updating, providing updates on everything COVID leave related, especially, but even outside of the COVID realm in New York State and federal laws. There's also a COVID library on there. So if you need an affirmation document for any of the leave, just for record keeping purposes for your employees, you can find that there as well. The IRS website is a good place for things on the employer retention credit and other things that are processed through a tax credit versus funding like the PPP. And then, of course, the CDC website and really the DOL website, which is not on here, are good resources for a lot of COVID guidance on when to quarantine, when not, and the leaves that are available. And this will go out afterwards, so you'll have all this in there. And then just a reminder, it's a lot of information we covered today. It's confusing while you guys try to do everything else that is involved in running a business or running an HR department or whatever it might be you're doing. So if you have questions about any of this afterward that, you don't feel comfortable broaching in this presentation publicly, or, you review this later and have more questions, certainly reach out to myself or Jeremy with questions, email, phone, whatever it might be. And we are happy to help with this or, any other questions you have about benefits or HR needs, even outside of the COVID stuff. And you can always subscribe on my website as well, because I do send email newsletters with information on things like these webinars or just updates also. So from there, we'll open it up to questions. I do see one here. Can you use New York State and FFCRA or federal COVID leave time together, I guess is what this question is, 5 days and 80 hours total. So basically, if you, and this is what most people should have been doing in 2020, if you are going to opt into and do the optional FFCRA leave now, which is the 80 hours or 10 days, at least for quarantining and isolating and vaccinations, you should just be having the New York State required leaves kind of run in tandem with that. So doing the federal or FFCRA counts as doing the New York State as well. And that way you're kind of, meeting your compliance needs through New York State, but getting a federal tax credit while doing it. That would really be the only reason you should do the FFCRA, is so that you don't have to just pay out of pocket the New York State stuff. Any other questions at all, you can submit through the chat or, through if you want to unmute yourself, you can shout it out as well. Nothing else. Everyone's good. All right. Well, thanks for attending. Everyone, sure, is just anxious to roll into the weekend. Again, reach out with any questions afterward. We'll be sending a recording of the video and also a slide deck for your reference as well. And otherwise, thanks for attending, and we hope to see you on additional programs.
Thanks, Emily. Thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Matt, for Paylocity's sponsorship of this as well.
Matt never sent me lunch though, so I'm starving.
On its way, Greg.
Appreciate that.
Get out there. All right.
Take
Bye,
care, everyone.
everybody.
I know.